Hello again, and thanks for listening to my brief recap from last week. Thank you for your patience and your continued enthusiasm. A little bit about writing poems, shifting from not just sort of deconstructing a poem into various parts, but what does that all add up to? And a lot of you have been kind of making these moves towards larger interpretations over the past few weeks, but I'm going to provide you just a sort of more systematic way of writing about poems, since this is a college course and those are some of our course objectives, which are to kind of read carefully, to analyze, and to apply terminology and practices with literary analysis. So a little bit about the basic principles of writing poems. In writing about a poem, the most important thing to remember is that a poem is not an essay or a message, right? We've all come to that conclusion. It's a thing imagined, an artwork like a piece of music or a painting or a dance. Your first task is to see how the theme of the work is being imagined, how the literal statement of the poet's feeling has been transformed. After that, you can experience the poem as you hear a piece of music or see a dance, something unfolding itself in time, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Or you can see it from afar in the way you see a painting, as a space full of things and colors, as we've done with Peter Bruegel, set in relation to each other. Both of these ways of seeing are indispensable. Considered as pieces extending themselves over time, poems have a plot, not so much one of events as one of feelings. A poem might begin in despair and rise towards hope, as we've seen, or might begin in hope and end in despair. A good question to begin with when reading a poem as a series of events in time is how the place you find yourself in at the end is different from the place you found yourself in at the beginning, and we've been doing that over the past few weeks. If you take stock of Z, where you end up, and A, where you begin, you're likely to be able to plot the rest of the letters that lie between. Considered as a space where parts are arranged in relation to each other, poems have a configuration just as paintings do. The poet may contrast one part to another, as painters put light against shade, or set one part above another in a hierarchy, or may create an imbalance by which 12 lines are outweighed by a closing couplet. A good question to begin with when reading a poem as a spatial arrangement is what parts it falls into and how they relate to each other in size, feeling, tone, and language. And that's exactly what we did last week with our examination of elegy. So let's take a brief example of how we might go about this. I have a brief lyric by Robert Herrick as an example of how we might approach a poem. We must, of course, read it whole before saying anything, since we can't really estimate the beginning until we have seen the end. And reading it whole means thinking about the title as well. And Robert Herrick is writing this, he was alive between 1591 and 1674, so 17th century poet. Divination by a Daffodil. When a daffodil I see, hanging down his head towards me, guess I may what I must be. First, I shall decline my head. Secondly, I shall be dead. Lastly, safely buried. We can say at first reading that the poet compares himself and his mortality to a transient natural object. This is not a new idea. What was Herrick done to turn it into a poem? How has he newly imagined this theme? And so we're going to be continuing to do these kinds of rhetorical moves, thinking about theme, and kind of how we break down a poem in a systematic way this week in your own poems that you'll find in a minute. So he has, first of all, made the commonplace act of seeing a flower into an act of divination. In classical times, priests divined the future by examining the entrails of a sacrificed animal. Herrick transfers this bloody act to something light and beautiful and glancing when he chooses as his symbolic object, the daffodil, with its characteristic drooping head. Second, Herrick doesn't begin with the comparison of his fate to that of the daffodil. We might have said, when a daffodil I spy, I know that I, like it, shall die. Instead, he divides his poem into two parts. He reserves the comparison to the second half of the single-sentence poem, leaving us to guess, as we read the first half, what he might be going to divine from his daffodil. You can see that break right here. When you note the general metrical scheme of the poem, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, you can see that the author wanted the first word of the line to bear emphasis, but not really for the purposes of the first half, which could equally have been read weak, strong, etc. A daffodil appears to me, his head is hanging down, and we can guess from that what we must be. The real purpose of the meter is clear when we arrive at the second half of the poem, though. It's to give weight to first, secondly, lastly, which ring with an emphasis in summoning up the last stages of life, like illness, death, burial. And when you examine the rhyme, which is C, me, B, so A, with head, dead, and buried, it should be pronounced buried, to rhyme, is BBB. You see that it possesses the same inevitability in the second half. The relatively uninteresting rhymes of the first half, like C, me, and B, are supplanted by the death knell of head, dead, and buried. Once you have studied the symbolic imagination, the words, the syntax of the sentences, the poem's division into parts, and the rhythm and rhyme, then we're prepared to make a sketch of the drama of the poem, like seeing the beginning, the middle, and the end as elements of the poem, also unfolding like human emotion. Someone is speaking the words of the poem, and that someone is now you. Lyrics are actually designed as scripts for performance, not by an actor, but by the reader. Speak the poem as if it were you who had been compelled into speech by something that had upset your equilibrium. Otherwise, you would have had no reason to break into words. Then try to imagine the backstory behind your utterance. What was happening to you before the poem began that makes you speak in this way? This is where you must use your imagination, and I think probably the most important part of reading a poem. Presumably Herrick has often seen daffodils, but something has recently happened, a sense of aging or maybe approaching death, that makes this daffodil into an emblem he uses to divine his future. Interestingly, though, Herrick was a clergyman. He makes no mention in this poem of an afterlife, choosing to see himself in purely material terms, as another living being on a par with an unremarkable flower. I think it's pretty remarkable, though, because it's something that we're seeing right now happening. On the other hand, his method in this poem, divining a message from a natural object, is very much a religious method, as his title suggests, by which man reads messages from God in the works of God's creation. 17th century poetry is full of such messages drawn from natural things and events. So what is kind of the takeaway then? To sum up, Herrick has made his theme, man's mortality, into a poem by imagining that one can divine one's fate from a flower, by arranging a perfect spatial symmetry, 3 lines each, to flower and man, and by letting us hear, after the inoffensive first 3 lines, the heavy tread of his own death announcement. And so what I'd like us to do this week is to try to begin making these initial moves where we're reading the poem for sense first, from beginning to end, including a sort of examination of the title, thinking about the symbolic imagination, the words, the syntax of the sentences, how the poem is divided into parts, and a comment about rhyme or rhythm if it's something to remark upon. And so here's an example of how to kind of break apart a poem for those who are sort of more inclined for like concrete steps. The theme imagined, let's just say initially, was poet compares himself as a mortal compared to natural object. What were some of the symbolic objects in this poem? A daffodil, which has a drooping head, for example. What kind of meter? Was there a particular rhythm? It gives weight to the first, second, and last. That's the sort of most important aspect of that meter that we probably notice in this writing. Emphasizes the last stages of life, like illness, death, and burial. First, secondly, lastly. That's kind of interesting to see in a poem, right? And then rhyme. What do we notice about rhyme? Well, it seems like these first 3 rhymes, C, me, and B, are become sort of parallel to head, dead, and buried. They're supplanted by those 2. A, and then B. So what do we take away? How do we sketch the drama of the poem? Speak the poem as if it were you who had been compelled into speech by something that had upset your equilibrium. So you're going to kind of inhabit the poem. And this is, a technique that a lot of people have to use, is empathy, right? But I would imagine a lawyer would have to do something like this. I would imagine a doctor would have to do something like this, to kind of place yourself in someone else's shoes to understand where they're coming from. Try to understand the backstory behind your utterance. What was happening to you before the poem began that makes you speak in this way? This is where you must use your imagination. So this is the sort of heart of reading poetry, using your imagination and trying to come to some conclusions based on that and that imaginary sphere. All of these pieces here will come together to provide you with an initial reading of the poem, an initial understanding. Herrick has made his theme, man's mortality, into a poem by imagining that one can divine one's fate from a flower and man, and by letting us hear, after the inoffensive firstly lines, the heavy tread of his own death announcement. So we kind of put here the heavy tread of his own death announcement as a result of this metrical scheme, right? You can see all of these different aspects working in our interpretation of the poem. The theme of man's mortality from the opening, imagining one's fate from a flower, how we're interpreting the symbolic object, and by letting us hear the metrical scheme here about the sort of impending death. The death announcement is what we're kind of concluding about this poem. So enough from me. What I want to do is throw this to you and ask you to have some fun this week. I would like, for the next 2 weeks, Unit 6 and 7, to work on our own poetry analysis. Now, we're just doing the first part of a poetry analysis today, really just trying to come to conclusions about what the meaning is and how we're getting to that meaning. But then we'll talk next week about how to actually write a longer conclusion, a longer assessment of the poem to really, draw that particular interpretation out. What I want you to do this week is to create a new page on your existing Google site. And this page is going to be dedicated to a poet in residence at the Chicago Poetry Center. One of the many things that our own Chicago Poetry Center does is they have poets in residence who teach in schools. For in-school residencies, poets meet with their classrooms weekly and publish student work after each session on our school blogs. Each week, our poets and students read, write, discuss, and perform poetry. After-school residencies can run just like an in-school residency program, or they can be tailored to build an after-school poetry club, a performance poetry team, open mics, and other opportunities. And so what I want you to do this week is to look a little bit. I want you to notice any of the poets that are in residence right now, peruse any of their available published poetry, and see if there's anything that actually speaks to you, including a sort of inclusion of the poet's name and a chosen poem at the top of your new ePortfolio page. So I think a lot of the work this week will just be exploring contemporary poets, especially the ones that are in the Poets in Residence at the Chicago Poetry Center. I'm also trying to suss out if you can access any of their poems. Some of them might be hard or tricky to find, but that might take a little bit of time, but I think you'll find someone, and some poetry that will speak to you. Select one poem from your chosen contemporary poet and complete an initial analysis, which is something that we just did with Robert Herrick's poem. What about the theme? Any symbolic objects, metrical schemes, rhyme, modeled similarly to the investigation that we just did. You do not have to make your investigation look the same as that flowchart that I included on that first page, but you can if you want. You can use like Canva or Getmine. Those are two platforms that allow you to make flowcharts. Please map your thinking carefully so that we can better understand how you've arrived at your close reading statement concerning your poem. And so the outcome is to really maneuver your way through the poem, but to do so in a way that will allow you to access your imagination and to make a sort of hypothesis or a sort of final statement, a takeaway of that particular poem, something that we've been working on in our collaborative reading. But actually, when you get to that final statement, making sure that there are some features of theme, symbolic objects, meter, or rhyme that kind of play into that particular interpretation. Share your ePortfolio page by publishing your page and copying it to our Unit 6 composition corner, which you can do right here. You'll put the subject, maybe the title of the poem, or the poet and the title of the poem, and share that with your peers this week. By Friday, please respond to 5 other ePortfolio pages that offer feedback on the evidence close reading that they offered, and feel free to offer enthusiasm and further insight for your peers. We'll be completing a fuller analysis next week. I'm excited to see what you find this week through those poets in residence. And just a side note, there's been a recent Bruegel discovery. This isn't Bruegel the Elder, but this is Bruegel the Younger. But, working in a similar scheme, and just found and sold this painting for almost $1 million in France. And for anyone who's interested, The Mill and the Cross is a movie about Peter Bruegel's paintings, The Elder, and you can access this for free through COD's Canopy. Thank you so much for listening and have a great